Hi everyone, welcome back to our 5-minute Bible study series. My hair is sticking up. I try so hard to get people to believe that I'm normal in these videos, and then stuff like this happens. Oh well, we're going to press on anyway. Today we are talking about 1 Samuel chapter 14, and I better hurry up because this is a pretty long chapter. It's easily the longest chapter that we've encountered so far in the book of Judges. It's so long, in fact, that I had to just drop the application section because I have so much text on the outline that there was no way that it was going to fit. So let's jump in. This PDF is on the website. You can download it if you want. There's a link in the description. When did these events take place? Israel's first king, you probably know his name by now. It was Saul. He was appointed king in approximately 1050 BC. And according to chapter 13, verse 1, the events in this chapter took place several years after that. Saul reigned until about 1010 BC, so we're somewhere in the in-between. We now need to discuss our important characters for this chapter. We have Saul, who, as I mentioned, was the first king of Israel. He was from the tribe of Benjamin. He had a son named Jonathan, who's going to be featured in this chapter and in upcoming chapters. He was a brave man, as we find out in chapter 14, and a very honorable man. Good friend of who? Do you know? David, who would be the next king of Israel. Then we have Jonathan's armor bearer. This is the person who, carried Jonathan's armor. He was like his assistant in the army, and God used him and Jonathan to win a great victory over the Philistines in this chapter. The Philistines are our last character. They are the longtime enemies of Israel, and if you remember, they gathered an army to fight against Israel in the last chapter. We now look at our map for just a brief period. The Israelites fought with the Philistines from Michmash to Ajalon in this chapter. Those cities are about 15 to 20 miles apart, and that's going to come into play in our outline. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, this chapter was a little harder to understand, to get my head wrapped around than some of the other chapters that we've read. I had to read it like 4 or 5 times to really feel like I had a grasp on it. So if you were a little bit confused, don't worry, you weren't the only one. But I think I got it. And now that I got it, I feel like I really appreciate this chapter. So let's talk about it. This first section is really cool. Verses 1 through 23. Jonathan and his armor bearer defeat the Philistines. So in 1 Samuel chapter 13, as we just talked about, the Philistines brought a large army to Michmash, and they were going to crush the Israelites. Saul and 600 men who were with him were in a cave near Gibeah. Rather than staying in the cave with his father, Jonathan took his armor bearer and he approached the Philistine garrison. Jonathan wanted to fight the Philistines, and he knew that God could potentially help him to defeat them. He told his armor bearer, quote, "It may be that the Lord will work for us, for nothing can hinder the Lord from saving by many or by few." He's like, if God wants to, he can win this whole battle with just me and you. Right? It didn't seem like anyone else had any better ideas. Everyone was in fear in the last chapter, right? So Jonathan's like, I'll go handle this job myself. But he wanted to make sure that it was the Lord's will. He decided that when he approached the garrison and they spotted him, if they told him and his armor bearer to come up to the garrison, then they would take that as a sign that God was with them and that God wanted them to attack when they got to the garrison. If the Philistine watchmen told them to remain where they were and that they would come out to them, then they would discern that it was not the will of the Lord for them to attack. So as the two warriors, Jonathan and his armor bearer, approached the garrison, they were spotted by the Philistines, and the Philistines told them to come up to the garrison. So that was their sign. Concluding that God was with them, Jonathan and his armor bearer, just these two men, attacked an entire garrison of Philistines. They struck down 20 men and then threw the Philistine camp in its entirety into a panic. And God obviously had his hand in this as well. God fought alongside Jonathan and his armor bearer, and the text says that he sent an earthquake, which is interesting. God also caused the Philistines to become confused and to fight one another. So they were killing each other with their weapons. And that's really interesting because in the last chapter, you remember the last chapter concluded by saying that the Israelites were outgunned by the Philistines. They not that they actually had guns. The Israelites didn't have weapons because they didn't have any blacksmiths. right? So can God win a war with an army without weapons? Yeah, he'll just turn the weapons of the enemy on themselves. So that's kind of cool to see. So there's this chaos going on in the Philistine camp. Jonathan and his armor bearer are being champs and striking down Philistines and conquering the world by themselves. And when Saul's camp, who's like back here hiding, when they realize what's happening, they hurried to join the battle. And all the people who were hiding in Israel came out to finally join the battle because they saw that God was with them. And so the text says, so the Lord saved Israel that day, and the Philistine army started to retreat. Now, our second section, verses 24 through 46, things get kind of weird. Sauls Vow. As the Israelites were chasing the Philistines as they were retreating, Saul put his men under an oath, a mandate. He told his men that they were not allowed to eat any food until the evening because they needed to focus on defeating the Philistines. Okay, so they weren't allowed to eat. Well, Jonathan, he wasn't there when his father gave this mandate, probably because he was off conquering a garrison by himself and with his buddy. He was not aware of the oath. So later in the day, he came across some honey in the forest and he ate some of the honey. Later on, when he was informed about his father's oath, this was later in the day, and he questioned his father's judgment in doing that because he saw how the honey had revived him, had given him new energy, and the Israelites had not won as decisive a victory as they could have over the Philistines because the men were tired. They didn't have any energy. They chased the Philistines from Michmash to Ajalon, which if you look on the map, it's 15 to 20 miles. So they're doing hand-to-hand, man-to-man combat with swords and clubs and whatever, doing 15 to 20 miles of running. And Saul's like, oh, well, none of you guys can eat. So Jonathan's like, that was a bad decision. By the time the men were allowed to eat later that evening, they were so hungry that they started killing animals and eating them without properly bleeding them. So they were eating the blood, which was forbidden in God's law, all because of Saul's weird oath. Saul later discovered that Jonathan had actually broken the oath, and the mandate, and even though he hadn't known about it, he was ready to put Jonathan to death. And the men, his army, were like, you're not going to put Jonathan to death. God has worked through Jonathan this day to bring salvation to Israel in a great way. So the people had to save Jonathan from his own dad, from this strange oath that he made that just did nothing but diminish the victory of Israel. So we'll come back to that idea at the end, but let's talk about our final section. This is verses 47 through 52, Saul's battle with Israel's enemies. This is just kind of a summary of what goes on later in Saul's life, the battles that he fought. So God gave Saul and the Israelites victory over many of their enemies. Later on, Saul went on to fight the Moabites, the Ammonites, the Edomites, the Amalekites, the Philistines, and the kings of Zobah. The Israelites experienced, quote, hard fighting with the Philistines all the days of Saul. So they're kind of like the perpetual enemy. And then verses 49 through 50, they give the names of Saul's sons and daughters. He had 3 sons, Jonathan, Ishva, and Malchishua, and then his daughters' names were Merab and Michael. Do you hear that dog? Every single time I film, that dog barks. He barks at everything that walks by the house. Please, for the sake of the spread of the gospel and people who film YouTube videos, just buy cats. Okay, so let's think about this chapter in the big picture. Like, why is this chapter here? What is it communicating to us? Well, we already saw a mistake that was made by Saul in the last chapter. And we're going to see this pattern of Saul is kind of falling apart. He's not going to be the king that he was supposed to be, who God wants him to be. So here I think we're seeing that again. Israel thought that their king was going to solve all of their problems, but yet their king is hiding in a cave at the beginning of this chapter, and it's actually his son who doesn't rely on human strength, but he says, you know what, like, I'm just going to trust in God to go up here and to win this victory for me, right? So it all comes back to God's the one in the end who has to lead this nation to victory. It's not the king. And so I think that message is being reiterated, but it's also a statement about who Saul is, his leadership, and how he's failing the nation, and how, he started off with so much promise that people put all of their faith in him, but at the end of the day, it's still God who's showing up to save Israel. So I think that's part of it. And then we see Saul, Jonathan goes out here. He begins this battle in an incredible way. He gets this early victory. And then all Saul does is kind of get in the way by making this oath that ends up minimizing the victory that Israel should have had and just getting in the way of something that God started. So, again, it's sad that Saul made the mistake that he did in the last chapter, because you look at this and you think, wow, Jonathan would have been a great king. But because of Saul's sin in the last chapter, now Jonathan can't be king because the kingdom is going to another family. Samuel already told Saul that. But also in this chapter, I think, sorry, I'm way over time. But we always talk about David and Goliath. Right? David was a good friend of Jonathan's. We talk about David and his victory over Goliath and how incredible that was. But this is Jonathan's David, or this is Jonathan's Goliath. And maybe this is even more impressive than what David did with Goliath. I mean, at the end of the day, Goliath was huge, but he was only one man. Jonathan takes his armor bearer and he's like, let's go fight this entire garrison of men. And then he goes and does it with God's help. So I think Jonathan definitely deserves some credit, more credit than he often gets. So, okay, those are my only observations. I'll let you go finally. That is 1 Samuel chapter 14, quite a chapter.